Okay, so we are now recording. So welcome again, everyone, to our weekly call, which this week, if I seamlessly um, attempt to switch to my slides, let's see if this works. Yeah, just put up the slide, which is, as always, our long-term sponsor is DNS OARC. So thank you to the OARC team for the sponsorship. Two of them are on the call, possibly three of them even are on the call today, which is good to see. Right, so the theme for our call, we're going to do a quick review of some of the highlights from the recent OARC and RIPE meetings in Prague, all of 2 weeks ago. In a surprisingly warm Prague, as I recall. So just sort of call out some of the highlights from that, in case you either were there but missed something, or equally you weren't there but wish to catch up with the recorded materials. So hopefully signpost you to some of the more useful things. And then, as always, time permitting, we'll go through some of the sort of recent news highlights and such. And as hopefully will be the case this time round, I'll call out a few things which I thought were interesting, but I will happily take input from others as well along the way. For things either I've missed, forgotten, overlooked, or otherwise not thought to mention or do justice to. So feel free for the. There are various people on the call that were at both of these meetings, so do jump in with your comments as well. Not least of which, because through an untimely case of food poisoning, it's entirely possible I missed the entirety of the first day of the OARC meeting. And because of the proximity with RIPE and ITF, I haven't completely caught up with everything from the Saturday. So especially on the Saturday, if you've got things you want to highlight, that will be most helpful. But notwithstanding that, just as a reminder, the meetings were, OARC was Saturday and Sunday, 26th, 27th October, immediately followed on the Monday through Friday of the following week by RIPE, both in the same hotel, the Clarion Congress Hotel, in the outskirts of Prague. There were, I think, just around 150, slightly over 150 people registered for OARC, of which about 4/5 were in person, about 30 were remote. And then for RIPE, that rose by the time of the meeting taking place to 950 people registered, of which roughly a third were remote, so sort of 650 or thereabouts were registered to attend in person, and it certainly felt like a reasonable number. I didn't count them all, but that order of magnitude were present in Prague for the respective meetings. Okay, so in terms of structure for these, I'm just going to refresh your memory of things that we highlighted prior to the meeting, and then just make a few comments on some of those, with a caveat that I wasn't present in person for the Saturday, so do bear that in mind. And I'm not going to go through every single session, although comments from anybody else are welcome for any of the sessions. Just a reminder that the OARC team sort of kicked off on the Saturday by talking about some of the tools that are available, particularly the day in the life of data, which both Matt and Jerry referenced. And then there were two panels, the first of which came immediately after that, which looked at protocol vulnerabilities, so security related stuff in various ways. And then following on from that, in the afternoon, again, there are a number of presentations, and I was going to reference just some of these. Not all of which were ones that we highlighted beforehand, which is always a good thing to say that other good things happened. So, for example, I just referenced the presentation that Robert gave from the well, Robert works for Wellbone, but he's, as you may recall, they're a key part of the DNS for EU consortium. And in essence, in his presentation, he explained their approach to anonymizing the logs that they capture from their open resolver to allow security research to take place, but in a privacy preserving manner. Basically contrasting with those open resolvers that don't have any logs and therefore miss out on any potential for security research on the one extreme, if you will, and then on the other extreme, some of the protective DNS servers that maybe log everything so they can get the absolute best possible security outcomes from their activity, but obviously at a potential cost of privacy. So it was interesting to hear the approach that the DNS for EU team are deploying so that they do capture quite a lot of useful data, but also have taken quite a few efforts to maximize its sort of privacy preserving attributes. I won't try and sort of summarize the approach. Have a look at the slides, watch the video when it's available for that, but it looked like a pretty robust approach from what I could see. Also, on the Saturday afternoon, Wouter de Vries just talked about the impact that TLD name servers performance can have on the end user experience. I can't immediately think of any other presentations recently that I've seen that have covered that, so that was useful to see, and yeah, I think that's a good bit of research to just pull up on. To really highlight that can make a difference to the end user experience amongst obviously many other factors. And then the last one I'll mention from the Saturday was Pallavi's presentation on generative AI. No conference nowadays would be complete without the mention of AI. But interestingly, she highlighted that if you just take sort of bog standard sort of generative AI models. I think she used ChatGPT, and there was definitely one other which I can't immediately remember, but just as examples, and ask them questions about DNS. They will make mistakes, but you can reduce the potential for mistakes by using an alternative approach, which I've seen this mentioned in a few places now, retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, R-A-G, which basically you furnish the model with additional data on a specific subject, and that greatly improves the accuracy of the responses that you get, which might be pertinent, for example, if you're using AI to augment your sort of customer service responses, etc. Perhaps by providing a chat function to clients. So it was just interesting. She put some examples in the slides where the answers look plausible but are actually wrong, and then by using the sort of retrieval augmented generation, how you can actually fix that again with an example to illustrate the point. So our AI overlords aren't quite there yet, I think, is the sort of my take on that. Now, before I move on, does anyone want to jump in with anything else from the Saturday that you think was especially noteworthy?
Yeah, me, I
Yeah,
guess.
Dinesh, I mean, yeah.
Yes. So I first like to say thank you for the review because I was hardly in the room. So this is a good review for me. Um,
Well, I
so,
wasn't in the room at all, to be fair, Dinesh, but
um, yeah, I mean, a couple of things that you mentioned, the videos. So I just wanted to mention that the videos are in post-production. We should have them available soon. As for the date, I don't know yet, but we're trying to get them done as quickly as possible, and they'll be on YouTube. Um, we also, for the first time ever, although we've been running a mentor program for a while, we changed it up a bit this time, where we actually matched delegates to mentors and um, did an introduction before the meeting, actually 2 or 3 weeks before the meeting, so that there was some conversation between them, and then we had a morning thing for a meet and greet for them. So that's how we did things a bit differently. And I know a couple of the participants on this call were in that as well, and we've all also had some good feedback. But of course, we're going to evolve that and make it better based
It
on the
was it
feedback
was
we've
it was very
received.
good, Dinesh. Thank
Yeah,
you. Very good.
thanks,
Yeah,
Jim. Yes,
I was a recipient. It was great.
I saw, yeah, no, I saw you on the call. I'm like, yep, you were there. You gave us the feedback. So thank you very much for that. Thanks for your comments. I really appreciate it. Anything that we can do to make it better would be good as well. So so you know, we're always looking to make things better in that way. One more thing is, even though we've not gone on to Sunday yet, but it was on a Saturday, the panel session. The panel session was done in a slightly different format this time, where the PC were trying to experiment with something completely different. So it was a case of actually let us just have the talks first, and then the panelist will ask the questions to the panel individually. So that was a slightly different format. So those who attended and those who will see the videos, if you can provide us with feedback on what you thought of that format, whether we should continue with that, whether we should change it slightly, but also the topics that we had. I know that it was very research based this time, so we're looking at more operational things for next time, hopefully. And I would suggest to the participants here that if you are able to be on a panel at the next OARC, then please let us know. Just wanted to get that in, but that's it. Thanks for the time you've given me, Andrew.
I think, Andrew, the comment was from me would be that having the four speakers on security and then a panel with them in afterwards, I found very good.
Okay.
So to Dinesh's point, if it was four people talking about operational stuff that was sort of grouped together or adjacent, and then having a panel session on that would be good too. Both days had it. It was a good format. So definitely worked for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks.
And you'll see in the chat also, Dinesh, positive feedback from David as well.
Oh, yes.
On a sort of mentor scheme. So that clearly was well received, which is good to know.
Thank you, David. And I'll pass that on to Rebecca, who's the one who actually had the time to put this together for this time around. So thank you for that.
Okay, and then just moving on to the Sunday, again, same approach. I'll just call out, I think, 4 or 5 elements. So this, again, is very subjective and selective, deliberately. So John Todd, who many of you will know from Quad 9, gave a sort of presentation on how the Quad 9 team use Vector to process, I think it was a very high volume of DNS tap data, both high volume and also in very short time frames, to enable them to do a lot of data analysis. Hard to summarize that, well worth looking at the presentation if that's an area of interest to you. My takeout of that was that the tool, Vector tool, seems to be very flexible in the formats it can both take in and sort of put out. And from the comments that sort of John gave, it's been a very sort of positive addition to their toolkit, I believe. But yeah, as I say, have a look at the presentation. Well worth it. And also later on the morning, Kathy Allman from ICS sort of talked about the use of the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, CVSS, to convey to users the severity of vulnerabilities when they're discovered. And therefore the potential impact to users. And she went on in a presentation to talk about the exploit prediction scoring system, EPSS, which is sort of complements it in some ways. Again, watch her presentation, but the sort of 2 points I took away from that were that a lot of the vulnerabilities, certainly in the DNS space, get the same scores, which was essentially one of the points that Kathy was making, that there wasn't a lot of differentiation of the scoring, both between vendors and also of vendors individually. Also, the EPSS seemed to be of limited use. And you'll hear me on the mic. This is not an area that I would claim any expertise in, but the EPSS seemed to be a mechanism to evaluate how quickly a vendor might address a vulnerability. The theory being that those which have perhaps got scored low then don't need to be attended to quite so promptly, if at all. And I did observe on the mic that if I was a bad actor, I might find that invaluable and possibly divert my attention to those that get a low EPSS score on the basis that they may be longer lived if I do develop a successful exploit. I think Kathy's taken that away for further exploration to see, because I think she also had some question marks about the usefulness of EPSS anyway. So we may hear more from Kathy about that in due course. And then later on in the day, it was an interesting a presentation by Jeff Damick and Tommy Jensen, amongst others, a number of authors of the presentation. I think they were both there from memory. Essentially, they've put together an internet draft, actually, so this is something is being sort of pitched to the IETF, but essentially a method that DNS clients could provide a securely verifiable identity to a server, and for performance reasons it's authenticated at connection level, not per request. It seemed to me to complement work that Microsoft and others have already done around a sort of zero trust, and add additional value to that potentially. And I haven't had a chance to talk to Tommy about it since, but that was my sort of first impression. So it looked quite interesting, definitely worth a look for those of you that got an interest in sort of authentication generally, or zero trust in particular. So yeah, that one I called out, and then just for completeness, I just put that the AGM followed immediately after. So the DNS OARC AGM followed immediately after the end of the OARC meeting itself. And for the record, the last year's audited financial statements and the AGM minutes were both approved. Board members were either re-elected in the case of Joe Abley and Ray Bellis, or elected for the first time in the case of Mauricio. And also the nominees for the programme committee for the sort of coming events are currently being sought. So anyone that wishes to volunteer, I'm sure will be gratefully received by the OARC team. And that's it from me, from just those three things I thought was worth highlighting from day two. Let's say I'm being deliberately selective. The other stuff was good as well. So the fact I haven't mentioned it is not an issue. I think there's a lot of high quality content. But again, does anyone else that was present want to jump in with anything that you think is particularly worth highlighting? Phil, please.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much to add really. I mean, thanks for the great summary. I think it's super useful, especially for, as you said, those who were not there in person. As Dinesh pointed out, the video is going to be just around the corner. We had a different AV team from the hotel than is our usual, so it takes time to get that post-processed. One thing that's worth mentioning is that for those of you who maybe have attended OARC meetings in the past, there were two small things worth noting. The one is that we do have now an extra session where the OARC staff uses, we have ability to present things just like, the data initiative, the digital discussion, and going forward, we might use that session for other topics such as BCP discussions. There's a lot of talk around that right now. And the other thing worth mentioning, and you already mentioned the AGM, is that we had our first. This is effectively our first in-person AGM since before the pandemic, and so that was worth it. In that, it was the first time that we only had a members-only meeting effectively for a number of years, and I think that was a great occasion for all those who are members of DNS OARC. Again, the event is always open to anybody who wants to join, but it's always a good thing to be a member of OARC. We think so, at least. It was worth mentioning that it was a great occasion for people to meet in person. And there might be more events like this in the future where we would have members only. So for those who are considering joining OARC, there's one occasion. There's always some great discussions going on where we might be able to bring up some topics that we don't necessarily aren't necessarily able to bring up in an open forum. But it was a super good event. No, not the least thanks to the team, the OARC team, of course, all the attendants, the RIPE folks who co-hosted us. The venue was also fantastic and did really a lot to pull off a really fantastic event. And I think it was, I mean, the attendance at the social and the amount of participants we have just says that I think people were very happy for having an OARC in Europe again. So thanks to everyone anyway, and thanks for highlighting all this, Andrew. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Phil. And you reminded me, I should also have mentioned, again, I was annoyed to have missed the social on the Saturday night, which are always, the OARC socials are always a highlight. So it was very disappointing to miss that this time. And I don't think he's on the call, but also it's sad that Steve couldn't make it this time. I think Dinesh tried a new version of the early retirement scheme for OARC by taking a colleague out for a walk on a mountainside. But Steve is battered and bruised, but has lived to fight another day, I think.
I think Steve will tell everyone that I pushed him down a mountain, but no, there's no truth behind that.
Yeah, but anyway, it was a very good event. Nice venue as well, and lots of good company for the weekend. And then that, of course, segued seamlessly into the RIPE meeting for the following 5 days. Again, as a reminder from when we did the call a couple of weeks back, I highlighted some of the components on the agenda to sort of recommend. And here's a list of them, all of which were good sessions. I was most impressed with Jeff Houston, who was a remote attendee, I think for both OARC and RIPE, if I recall, certainly for RIPE. He had planned to be in person in Prague and until he I think had a mishap on his bike and has broken or fractured I think 4 ribs, so was given very stern and clear advice by his doctor not to fly, and certainly not to fly 24 hours across the world from Canberra. So he did his presentation remotely, always packed with a lot of data. Definitely worth watching that and variously the other sessions. But the ones that I'm going to actually call out were two different ones, which are on the Tuesday, the security working group met. There was some interesting content that I don't think I'd been to the security working group previously from my limited exposure to RIPE meetings, but so I was particularly interested to hear Hisham Ibrahim from the RIPE team talk about how they respond to information requests from governments and others. Explained that what their approach is, what their policy is. Also, a really useful presentation by Antonio Finito from one of the Dutch universities. I think Twente's Dutch university. I may have made that up, but my geography is failed me. Anyway, it was a good presentation. He did a comparison of 13 different block lists. To really compare and contrast them, and to sort of greatly simplify his conclusions. There wasn't a lot of overlap between the different block lists. So if you want to have a comprehensive set of threat feeds, block lists, whatever, you need to have a portfolio of them, really, because they pick up on different things. But also some of them have got quite old content. I think from memory, from his slides, I think as old as about 3,000 or 4,000 days, which is pretty old. That said, if the content is still live, then I guess it's entirely valid to have old content on there. But I think he was maybe suggesting that some of the content isn't refreshed as frequently as it probably should be. So if you've got an interest in block lists, that's worth a look. And then finally, from sort of this grouping, there was a presentation by sort of two people from the UK Premier League talking about content piracy, which sort of segued neatly in some respects to the RIPE presentation on their approach to information requests, amongst other things. And certainly Hisham did respond to some of the points that they made. So that was quite a good linkage. Whether it was deliberate or not, I'm not sure. So I've sort of found that session quite useful because it's, as I say, content that I'm not so familiar with. So I mentioned that in case it's also of interest to any of you. And then perhaps on more familiar territory, the DNS working group took place on a Wednesday morning. Again, covered a variety of ground. I'll call out three things. Firstly, there's an announcement about the next DNS hackathon, which will be next March, middle of March, 15th to 16th in Stockholm. I think remote attendance will be possible for that. I think if that's of interest, do check that. It's put together by a combination of RIPE, DNS OARC and NetNod. I think NetNod are the hosts effectively because their meeting follows on from the hackathon. So it's a sort of three-way collaboration. I think the last one was really successful, so it's good to see that that's continuing. Couple of other things to call out. Raphael Samisi gave a presentation on but basically malicious sites that fall through the cracks because they have a very sort of short-lived life, and I think this is phishing sites, for example, and by the time they're picked up, their half-life is gone, and they're sort of disappearing again. So they're exploiting the sort of 24 hours it often takes for sites to be picked up in the zone updates. So they could have sort of bloomed and gone almost like mayflies in the space of 24 hours. So he did that, pulled together some research to look at that first 24 hours. So interesting presentation. I've not seen anything else on that topic previously. Maybe other people have. And then sort of by contrast, we then had a short presentation on the use of extended DNS errors, which are now a thing but aren't really being used widely in anger as yet. So it was a good reminder of the value that they bring, and I think encouragement to use them. I think more are going through the ITF at the moment, so their use is being expanded and then being built on with other developments like structured DNS error messaging. Yeah, so if you've not looked at extended DNS errors, that's a 20-minute presentation, is a useful introduction to the topic. And that's probably it from me for RIPE. Again, I've deliberately been selective, so I'll pause to see if anyone else has got anything that you want to highlight from RIPE, or that suddenly struck you indeed from the OARC session that you'd like to call out before we move on. If you do, put something in the chat, unmute and talk, raise your virtual hand if that's easier, whatever's best for you. And I'll just pause for a moment to see if anyone does. Seeing anything at the moment. Oh, I see a hand. Simon, do you want to jump in? You'll need to unmute first. Hi, Simon.
Sorry, my screen was getting covered in things that tell me I could do other things or whatever. I just want to press this button in the corner. I don't want to do all these other things. Yeah, it's clear, please. Oh, for those corner. Augmented generative AI. I assume you augment it with information you know, because I assume generative AI found stuff and why should you need to augment it with stuff that's already on the internet? But I assume it's material that's only known to you, as it were.
Yeah, yes. So let me see if I can find the relevant slide. No idea wherever it was. Oh, there. Yes. So yes. So just to be clear, so this is taking a general purpose sort of large language model that you're absolutely right has been trained on stuff, but relatively speaking, general purpose stuff. I think it's just making the point with some examples that the sort of typical training data is not overly specialist, and certainly in the sense of DNS. So if you ask it more specialized DNS questions, you may well get wrong or misleading answers. And as I say, the presentation that Palava gave included some examples using two different LLMs, whereas she then fed, maybe that's not the right technical word, but she fed some, I think, an ITF RFC into a large language model, then asked it a question on that sort of subject matter, and she then got a correct answer because it absorbed that additional data to sort of add sort of more generalist sort of content, then was much more on point. So I guess that was the point of the presentation. Say if you use a generalized,
I do tend personally to ask for references so I can actually go and see the stuff and read it myself, so I can see whether it actually makes sense or not to me. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. As an aside, a lot of LMs make up references because they're statistics.
Oh yes, I know.
So that's worth doing.
Or they overread them and join them into a stupid hole. Thank you.
Yes, exactly right. So be skeptical, I think, would be my one line takeout from that, and certainly don't deploy them as part of your customer service solution without proper care. Okay, right, let me just move on then to other stuff that's happened this week. So apologies for cycling quickly back through the slides. Right, so just a few things I'll just call out from the news just to sort of reorientate ourselves. First one, since I do occasionally like to talk about Encrypted Client Hello, the would-be extension to the TLS 1.3 standard. Say would be, that's because it's not yet it hasn't cleared the standards process, but despite that, it is being deployed in both browsers in Boring SSL and also on the server side by Cloudflare across all of its tiers. And the sort of news sort of back end of last week was that ECH content is being blocked in Russia, and there's some news coverage on that. And the first link on the screen is to that. On the back of that, that's prompted a variety of requests within the Cloudflare community pages, presumably by site owners, to allow them to configure ECH essentially to switch it off. I think principally this is on the free tiers because it is configurable on the paid for tiers on Cloudflare, but as far as I'm aware, not on the free tiers. So there's been some pressure from Cloudflare users to give them the ability to switch it off, presumably because they have a worthwhile base of sort of users in Russia, and they'd like to retain access to the site. I thought that was an interesting development. There's a sort of a few good write-ups on that. I've sort of pulled out one of those, but there are others if you use your favorite search engine. Also, this was something I hadn't previously picked up on. There's a malware called Steelfox that hijacks Windows PCs. But the interesting thing about this is it seems to use TLS 1.3 to hide its command and control or its C2 communications, and to stop it from being intercepted. So it's the first reference I've seen that's explicitly mentioned TLS 1.3 and it being abused by malicious content, in much the same way when encrypted DNS was first introduced. We saw a flurry of malware using particularly DOE to hide its command and control communication. So as I say, this is the first instance that I'd noticed anyway using TLS 1.3 for that purpose, which is why I highlighted it. Other stuff, there's some proposals for some improvements to ICANN's DNS abuse program, which I was interested to see. But obviously various other things. I'm not going through all of it. I'll maybe highlight just a couple of things. So one, Vacara picked up on a sizable DDoS attack, which took advantage of extremely high volumes of very small packets spread across a very high number of source IP addresses to try and overwhelm a site's defenses unsuccessfully in this case. So that was unusual behavior. And also just the sort of next one down in the middle of the screen, some work looking at post-quantum signature standardization, just looking at some of the candidates that have been put forward to this was by Cloudflare, funny enough, to assess their suitability for use in TLS 1.3. So very much post-quantum is sort of the flavour of the month. Whether it's for TLS 1.3 in this case, or separately, there's a couple of presentations at RIPE about the use of post-quantum signatures for DNSSEC as well. So a fair amount of work in that area at the moment. And then a bunch of other stuff not so relevant that caught my eye since we've just been talking about it. The one that's sort of second from bottom, an open letter from Ofcom, the UK regulator, to online service providers about the use of generative AI and chatbots. Coincidentally, given the discussion that we just had. So obviously you need to use that RAG process to make sure they're better, I presume. A few other bits and pieces, but you can sort of read through those at your leisure. There aren't many deadlines that are imminent. Only one that I'd noticed this month, or remaining this month at least. There's a few that have already gone, and that's if you want to respond to a consultation on the Internet Coordination Policy 2, ICP2, if you're in the policy space. You've got another 7-8 days, so I think that must be next Tuesday. To respond to that. So just that's coming up, and then there are sort of few things, deadlines to apply for things quite often. So for example, if you want to take part in the DNS hackathon in Stockholm, you've got until the 1st of December to indicate your interest. Equally, if you want to put a presentation in at the OARC meeting in early February in Atlanta. Then you've again 2nd of February for that, and then deadline sort of spread out again. So a few things coming up just to give a bit of thought to, and more in the first part of next year. In terms of other stuff, a reminder in terms of events, if you wanted to go to the ICANN meeting in Istanbul, well, if you're not there already, then you're late, because it's already started and runs through to the 14th. Although there are a few people there, some of whom went straight from Dublin, having previously been in Prague, so basically got a month on the road, which I think would be quite stressful, in my opinion, to do 4 weeks back to back. But there you are. If you're not at the ICANN meeting, just a reminder that later on this month, Echo are helpfully doing a readout of some of the highlights from that. So you can catch up by joining their sort of post-ICANN summary, which now seems to be a regular thing, which is marvellous. And there are various things coming up. The last thing I've got on my agenda for this year will be the Internet Governance Forum in Riyadh. And then before we know it, we'll be thinking about NANOG and OARC and so on in the new year. Topics from us. I already mentioned the other thing this week, or next week rather, we'll do the same as this week, but just reflecting on some of the highlights from the IETF meeting in Dublin. Which once I've had a chance to actually have those reflections. So we'll pick up on that next week, in case you were wondering. Yeah, I can see Carl in the chat has mentioned, yeah, some people would be their 5th week away if they've gone straight to the ICANN meeting, which is a long time on the road, if anyone's done that, rather than me, to be fair. Yeah, so that's the plan for next week. You can see we've got various other things lined up over the coming few weeks, and then before we know it, it's going to be Christmas, which is quite scary. Yeah, already nearly the middle of November. Not sure how that happened. So I hope that was useful. That's everything for me. So let me stop sharing my screen. So we can see each other, and we do have a little bit of time for any other business. So anything either that's occurred to people from the stuff we've just been talking about, including the OARC and RIPE meetings, or indeed anything else that's on your minds at the moment that you'd like to mention. And if so, as always, put it in the chat, raise your virtual hand, whichever's easiest for you, or just unmute if no one else is talking.
I saw somebody mention in the chat and was recommending the mentor. I don't know if they were referring to registering for a mentor at IETF, or whether OARC also offers that. But I registered for an IETF mentor / guide and would highly recommend it. It really helped add more and fill in some of the gaps around the edges.
Yeah, I think that was David was referencing the new OARC sort of program, but yeah, exactly the same principle. In fairness, Carl, and yes, I think certainly it's well worth it for anyone that's new to any of those. And even if I know in your case you had a number of colleagues also in Dublin, but in many ways just getting somebody else's perspective is quite interesting, to maybe mention a few aspects of something that maybe colleagues wouldn't pick up on, just to make it even more valuable. Yeah, I know all the different sort of programs are sort of trying to improve the experience for new participants in various ways, and I think all of them are very interested in any feedback as well, because I'm sure there's always things that you can do better next time round. And I guess for the people that are more long-standing participants, it's perhaps a reminder to us to actually volunteer to be mentors, because the programs are only as good as the people that step forward to help out. And it's interesting because it's a good way of testing your own knowledge of that thing that you're going to. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Carl. Anything else that anyone wants to sort of, as I say, any other reflections from the last couple of weeks, or indeed anything unrelated to any of that that you think it would be worth highlighting? Yeah, Chris, do jump in.
Yeah, this is my first time on this call. It's actually been very informative. Thank you.
Good. That's good to know. Well, as I've said, I think to others, if there's any topic that you would like to bring onto the call, feel free to either volunteer yourself, or if it's a topic you'd like to see covered, feel free to let me know. Preferably volunteer somebody else to cover it would be even better. Yeah, always happy to take suggestions from people on things that are of interest to talk about. So thanks for the comments. Good to know. Okay, last chance for anyone else that wants to mention anything. I'm not. Phil's put in the chat. I'm probably going to regret asking this. NZRS, Phil.
No, and .nz registry services, because somebody was commenting about with all these events back to back with ICANN and OARC and RIPE. There was, I think it's a Jonathan, I can't remember who it was I was chatting with, who attended OARC, and I think he'd been away for basically 5 weeks, because you don't exactly do a back and forth from New Zealand to Europe between events when you only have a week. So it makes more sense. As someone who used to travel extensively, at one point I nearly reached 180 days of traveling in 1 year. I called my tax office to find out if I was exempt from paying taxes in the country that year, and it says 10 more days and you would have been. It's like, shame. But
yeah, funny you should say that. As a humorous reference, there was a discussion at the ITF about whether or not it was reasonable to have content on the Friday, because some people point out they like to travel home on a Friday. One of the participants chimed in from, I think, New Zealand to say, as far as he was concerned, suck it up. He didn't say it in those terms, I'm paraphrasing. It took him 27 hours to get home, so he couldn't see why they couldn't manage to also do Friday rather than want to leave early for their 3, 4, 5, 8-hour flight, whatever. He didn't see what the problem was. Which I thought was fair enough. You get a different point of view, I guess, if you live in New Zealand, because anywhere is quite a long way away, pretty much.
absolutely.
Fantastic. Okay. I can see. Oh yes, and David. Yeah. I will confirm the arrangements for our panel discussion on encrypted DNS and resolver discovery in the next few days. So I've noted your willingness to participate in that, which is much appreciated. I'll let you know as soon as it's all finalised. Right, well, on that note then, I hope that was useful. I think the RIPE session recordings are all up on the site. I'll put a link to that with the link to the recording, so you can get at those if you're interested. And as you heard from Dinesh, the OARC recordings will be up imminently, I think. So all of the side material has been up for some considerable time, to be fair, on the OARC presentation. So it's just the recordings to add to the slides. So the slides are there in the meantime. If you want to peruse those, the recordings should be up quite soon as well. So hope that was useful. As I say, good to be back at home for a few days. But yeah, I really enjoyed the sessions in Prague, and well, as you'll hear next week, also in Dublin. But that'll be for the discussion on Monday. So with that, have a fantastic week, everyone. Thanks in particular to Dinesh and Phil for joining as well. That was much appreciated. And reminder, our long-term sponsor is DNS OARC, so thank you for that. Have a great week, everyone, and catch up same time next week. See you all there.
Thank you.
Andrew.